President Marion, members and guests, it's a real pleasure today for me to introduce to you and welcome John McKinnon. Not Ian, but John McKinnon. He's the man who's been sitting right beside me while we've been having lunch. For many of you, you probably don't, the younger ones don't realise that John has been a member of this Rotary Club for a number of years, but in recent times could not be here because of his postings overseas. But it's wonderful to have him back and able to bring those views and information on his postings, particularly to China, to us. John's had quite a noteworthy career in New Zealand Foreign Service. Posted first to Beijing in 1978 as a second secretary, then transferred to Washington, followed by Canberra, and in 1992 was New Zealand's permanent representative to the UN in New York. In 2001, he was posted as ambassador to Beijing, then returned to New Zealand in 2006 and appointed as Secretary of Defence, a significant role in the public service in New Zealand. Served in that role to 2012 and then followed a period as Executive Director of the Asia-New Zealand Foundation. In 2015, John returned again to Beijing for a second term as Ambassador for New Zealand in China, a very significant appointment at that time. So with this distinguished and extensive background serving in Beijing, there is no one better to speak on China today to us as China then and now. Please welcome John.
Well, thank you very much, George and President Marion. Kia ora tātou, or perhaps I should say, da jia xiao hao. No? At least one person understood what I was saying. It's great to be here and great to have a chance as a member to be able to speak to this group, but also slightly alarmed by the numbers of visitors who are coming. I'm not going to do a Russ and get everybody to stand up, but I would like to have a show of hands as to who has visited mainland China, by saying that I'm not counting Hong Kong. Actually, this is a worry. This is a worry because I work on the basis that when I talk about China, nobody actually knows what I'm talking about. Some of you I know visited us in the last few years while we were there, and some came even earlier. Some of you had the bad judgment to visit China when we weren't there, or to visit China when we were there and not see us, which is even more culpable. But either way, I think looking at that show of hands in the room, everybody's probably got a little bit of a sense about what China's about. And today I just want to talk a little bit about my, I guess, three things about China that I think have sort of changed in the last few years. Because as George so kindly mentioned, my China career started quite some time ago, back in the 1970s. When I'm talking to other groups of people, I say, most of you weren't born then. I don't, of course, have to say that to this group. But anyway, I also had to be very careful with my staff in the embassy in Beijing, some of whom were younger than my children, not to start going on about the 70s, because you could sort of see their eyes glazing over, thinking, oh, here he goes again, you know. But it is relevant in the sense that it gave me an intuition or a sense about what China itself had been through from the 1970s into the present day. So although it is, in a sense, history, what happened in the 1970s, and China today is a very different place, it's also relevant. This year is the 40th anniversary of the famous, at least famous in China, third plenum of the Communist Party in December 78, when Deng Xiaoping came back and when the policy of reform and opening up was launched. So although that is now, you know, a generation or more ago, it's actually very salient to what is happening in China at the moment. But I want to talk about three things, and in the short time I have at my disposal, and I'm conscious that the President will tell me when to stop if I'm running over time. One is that the character of the Chinese leadership at the moment. The second is, in effect, what I see as the increasing economic impact of China in New Zealand. And the third is the fact that the views of China throughout the world are now rather different from what they were perhaps 10, 20, let alone 40 years ago. And all of those things relate to the fact that for New Zealand, China is, and I think will remain into the foreseeable future, a very important country and a very important partner, but it's also very, very different from us. And it's trying to balance those two things, which I think is part of the sort of nature of the discussion we're having today about China in this country. But can I start off with, I mean, those of you who have been in China, and if you've been there in the last year or so, you'll realise that it's a very different country from what it was in the 1970s. And one of the ways it's different is the rapidity with which things can change. When you're dealing with markets which, you know, even on a conservative estimate, might be, you know, 100 million people or 150 million people. Now, if you can oscillate between 100 million and 150 million, you're not really too much worried about 4.5 million people in New Zealand. You know, it's like it's a sort of, you know, accounting error. But if you get into that market and you succeed, it's enormously beneficial. And the example I mentioned is this thing called the share bike phenomenon, which if you've been in China in the past 2 years, you'll know about. So these are the bikes where you pick them up in one point and you drive them to, you know, cycle them to another and leave them there. You don't, you in effect hire them for a period of time. Well, in January 2015, when I went to China, there was no such thing. They started about the middle of 2016, and by the end of the following year, they were literally everywhere. In Beijing, you couldn't actually walk down the street near where we lived without tripping over shared bikes. And everybody was into it. So, of course, there were all sorts of people wanting to make money out of this. In the end, as is the nature of, you know, capitalism and the raw, which is what you tend to see a lot of in China, 2 companies survived. And they were fighting it out still when I left as to which was going to be the, you know, maybe the monopoly supplier of shared bikes. But the interesting thing was, it was, of course, a very good initiative. It meant people got on bikes, they exercised, it was environmentally good, Russ, you know, excellent. And China's very conscious of that, of course. But also, for the people who were in the business, it provided a lot of data. So if you knew that X picked up a bike at this place and then dropped it off there, but X times 100 or 1,000, you know, that tells you something interesting. And it was that data, as much as anything, which is what the companies were interested in getting. But it was the speed with which this happened. And sometimes when in China, people talk about China, and Chinese people talk about this themselves, 5,000 years of recorded history, which is absolutely true. But what I think they lose sight of is that China is also modernising incredibly rapidly. In some ways, it's a more forward-looking society than New Zealand. The degree to which people will embrace novelty and innovation, particularly if it's associated with something, you know, some critical key brand and so on, is really remarkable. And it's something I think to bear in mind. It's opportunities for New Zealand, but it also tells you that this is a country of a rather different nature. Let me just briefly go through these 3 things I was going to talk about. Firstly, the current leadership of China. So all of you probably know who the current president of China is, but you may not be able to pronounce his name. At least you certainly don't if you follow Fox News, which I was listening to the other day. Surprise, surprise. And I don't know how they pronounced his name. Xi Jinping is the name, the way I pronounce it anyway. But he's the current leader of China. He became the leader in 2012. What has been interesting and has attracted quite a lot of attention is that earlier this year, they altered the constitution to enable Xi Jinping to stay on as president for as many terms as he wishes to be chosen for. That is significant, but I actually don't think it's as significant as the fact that the what they call the thought of Xi Jinping has been written into the constitutions of the party and the state. And this is quite remarkable in a way, because normally that would happen, if it happens at all, after somebody has moved on from office and moved into a different sort of part of their life. In this case, it's happened midstream, as it were. So the normal pattern is that a president such as Xi Jinping would serve 2 terms of 5 years. Now, in the middle of this, between 5 and the 10 years, suddenly this is now in the Constitution. Effectively, what that means is you can't oppose that thought. Ergo, you cannot oppose that person. And that's quite a strong statement about the way that Chinese people think about their country and think about the society. And what I would comment here, and this gets into this sort of political area which can be a little bit sensitive, Xi Jinping believes very firmly that it's the Communist Party which has both held China together and which will continue to hold it together into the near future, or into the indefinite future, actually. And for him, that's not just it's nice to have, it's quite central to the way he thinks about the country and thinks about society. And much of what you see in China which has those aspects which are a little bit alien to New Zealanders, comes out of that premise. And if you think about it in terms of, you know, is stability important? Is growth important? Is the environment important? Stability is very important for China. And so a commitment to a political system which delivers stability becomes something which is really, really significant, not just for Xi Jinping, but for a lot of people around him. And that is something which I think outside China people have a little bit of difficulty grasping. Now, the obvious comment is, well, you know, who chose him? You know, I mean, you know, who chose Trump? Who chose anybody? You know, and that's a reasonable question. But my own sense about it from being in China over many years is that while, you know, people might want to, you know, have some views about certain aspects of it, by and large, they accept the system as it is. Not, I think, because they're incapable of, you know, voting in the way that we vote, but more because they understand what China has been through in the past, and they recognise and see the value of what they have now. Which is not to say there are not issues about it, but I think it's something that it's worth trying to think about it, how it looks through Chinese eyes, to the extent that we can or we should. So that's one thing, and it's become quite evident and more salient in recent years than it was, say, when I was in China 10 or 12 years ago. That's something which is now very much forward, and if, for instance, you go to China on some sort of official business, whether it's academia, whether it's whatever, you'll probably get a stronger feel about the way in which the Communist Party operates in China than you might have before. Second point is what I call the economic impact of China in New Zealand, which has been something which people have been talking a lot about. When I was in China between 01 and 04, China was probably our, I don't know, 5th or 4th largest market. And now it's ranking up 1 or 2, depending on the time of day and what the Australian currency is doing. But basically, China has become very important for us, and part of that has come out of the free trade agreement we negotiated in 2008, the first that China negotiated with a developed country. And New Zealand's engagement with China has prospered off that. It's also prospered off the fact that the middle classes in China, what we loosely call the middle classes, have been growing, and they have a demand for many of the things we produce, whether that's scenery, whether it's infant milk formula, whether it's education, and we've benefited from that. But so, of course, have a lot of other countries. But for much of it, it was about New Zealanders going to China and selling stuff there. Now, of course, in the logic of things, it should be and will be two-way. So Chinese come to New Zealand and they consume and do things here. And I think for New Zealanders overall, this is a slightly more difficult proposition to come to terms with. So in my previous incarnation of the Asian New Zealand Foundation, we used to do surveys, and in fact I think they still do, of opinion about Asia amongst New Zealanders. And if you're talking about Asia, and this wasn't China specific, it was Asia more generally, if you talk about, oh, we export to those countries, that's great, everybody loves that. 90%, you know, we all think it's great to be able to sell things to other countries. If you talk about those countries coming here, whether as investors or migrants or students or whatever, it's still positive, but it drops quite significantly. So you're talking more 50, 60%. I hope my figures are right, Adele will correct me if I'm not. But the point is, there is understandably a difference between going to a country and doing stuff and that country coming to you and things happening here. And I think we, along with almost every other country in the world, is coming to terms with that reality. I don't think we're doing a bad job of it, but it's a change in the way that people have been thinking about China. Because if you think about it, people sort of thought China's over there. What's our view when China is here? It's a different sort of proposition, but it's in the nature of the way we undertake our economic relations that's going to happen. It's what's happened in the past with Australia or America or Japan or the UK. The third thing I want to mention, which has also changed, I think, is the view of China outside China, and particularly in some of the countries which we are traditionally very close to, such as Australia or Japan or the United States. Now, this gets into this rather murky area of sort of geopolitics, which is, you know, China's rising, Does that mean other countries are not rising, or are they falling? And how does this all relate to one another? And we've seen, or we are seeing, you might say, a manifestation of this in the current trade disputes between the US and China. Now, I'm not wanting to get into that, although I'm sure people will want to ask questions about it. I just want to make one point, which is that while there are some very idiosyncratic aspects, to put it respectfully, about the way the current US administration is dealing with China, I think it would be a mistake to think that it's very specific to President Trump. I think building up in the US over a period of years has been an anxiety about the China-US relationship and about what China has meant for the US, a sense that China's got more out of it than the US has, and also that the US has to really think hard about whether it's going to be able to continue on its present path without taking some fairly drastic action. So even without what is happening now, I imagine that there would still be some currents which would be quite, shall we say, anxious about what China's doing than the reverse. And that's sort of awkward for us, and it's awkward for a lot of people, because we have a very satisfactory relationship with China, which has been based on a very strong degree of mutual benefit, but also what we call a degree of mutual respect. But if we've got a lot of our friends saying to us, well, you have to be very wary about what China's up to and what it's doing, well, that creates something of a, this sort of choice thing. Everyone says, no, we don't want to choose between the US and China. But if both countries are saying to us, well, will you sign up here or will you not sign up there? Well, then it becomes a bit problematic. Now, I don't want to, I can respond to some questions. I don't want to go further into that, except to say that it creates a policy environment very different from the one that we had probably 10 or 15 years ago. There is a sense now amongst many people in the world that China has a strategic agenda and that it's out to displace the US as the sort of dominant power in the world. I don't actually accept that premise as it is, but there are a lot of things that China's doing, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, which raise questions in people's mind, and they start asking about it and wondering, well, where is this taking us? But at bottom, there is a very basic fact, which is China is getting richer and wealthier, and out of that, it's also getting stronger. That is not a process which is going to stop anytime soon. So in effect, for the rest of the world, we have to figure out, well, what are we doing with this China, which is now a bigger and a larger country than we thought even 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And if you're sitting in China, you're thinking, well, what's the big deal? This is what the rest of the world did. You know, this is what the Europeans did. This is what the Americans did. Why are we